I have some CSS over on the left-hand side, as well as some HTML. Essentially, all I have is two parent containers that wrap two different children each, children 1, 2, and children 3, 4. And then up here, I'm just giving the parents this nice black border, which we see on the right-hand side, as well as some margin and padding. And then inside of our children, we just have a little bit of padding and then some different colors for each one of our children, 1 through 4. That way we can easily distinguish our children from one another. And what we're going to do in this video is talk all about the different types of position that there are in CSS, so that way you can understand position and start to use position when you want to implement designs that either you think of or that you see other places. And the most important thing about understanding position is understanding the default CSS position. And the default CSS position is really straightforward. It is just going to be here a position which is static. Essentially, an element with position static, it just means that it behaves normally inside of the document flow. So as you can see here, we have a parent, and it is the very first element inside of our page, this HTML here. And then inside of it, we have its two children, and you see that they fill inside of this first parent. The second parent is on the page, and it has its two children inside of it. That is just because they're all statically positioned, which means they all just fall normally where they would inside of the document flow. So the children are going to be inside the parent. These two parents are going to be stacked on top of each other, just like they are in the HTML. So essentially everything just works normally with static position, and everything is laid out from each other. So element 1 is first printed, then element 2 is printed after element 1 on the screen. So static position, you just think of as the default. That's how everything works in CSS normally. The next type of position I want to talk about is a position called relative, which we're just going to put on our first child here. We're going to say position of relative. And this position is pretty similar to position static. If we save, you'll notice nothing actually changes. Everything is the same as before. But now that we've applied this position relative, we have the ability to apply different CSS properties called the top, left, right, and bottom, which essentially allow us to determine how we want to offset this element from its current container. Let's just say we set a top of 10 pixels. If we save, you'll notice something interesting. Our element number 1 has moved down 10 pixels. Essentially, we've moved the top of this element 10 pixels away from where it normally would be. If we change it to negative 10 pixels, you'll see it moves up 10 because we're moving the top of this element 10 pixels of the opposite direction. So instead of pushing it 10 pixels down, we're pulling it 10 pixels up from where it would normally be. We can do a similar thing with left, for example. And now we're pushing this element from its left side 10 pixels to the right. If we change this to be right instead, you can now see we've pushed this element from its right side 10 pixels. And that's the important thing to note, is this is not telling you which direction your element moves. It's instead saying which direction you want this change to happen. In our example, the right side of our element is going to be 10 pixels away from where it normally would be. So we're pushing from the right 10 pixels. And then finally, we have the last element here, which is going to be bottom, which is pushing us up 10 pixels from the bottom. And something really interesting you'll notice if we change this back to top is that element number 1 is actually overlaying element number 2. And that's because with relative position, what happens is our page pretends like everything is static positioned. So it renders like this. And then what happens is it goes through and does all of these different offsets for our element. So it's going to offset number 1 10 pixels down. But the page is already rendered with element 1 essentially in its normal position. So none of the other elements are going to move. They all pretend that element 1 is in its normal position, and that's how everything else in the page is going to react. But this position relative is just telling element 1, okay, now that everything's done, just move yourself down 10 pixels. So this allows us to really easily nudge things to the left or to the right without affecting how anything else on our page is laid out. This can be really useful when you want things to be positioned a certain way, offset from where they normally would be in the page without changing other elements on the page as well. So understanding this position relative is pretty important. But something that I think is much more important than position relative is the idea of position absolute. So let's change this element here instead of relative to absolute. And if we save, you'll notice something really interesting. Essentially, element number 1 here, it's pretended like it doesn't even exist. Our element number 2 has taken the place of element number 1, where element number 1 is normally at, as you can see by this red bar. And element 1 essentially is taking up the least amount of space possible where it normally would be in the document flow. And if we come down here and remove element 1, you'll notice every single other element on our page stays exactly the same. Nothing about them actually changes. And that's because by using position absolute, we actually take this element, number 1 here, out of the document flow. And when we render our page the first time through, we pretend child 1 doesn't even exist. It doesn't matter where it is. It doesn't impact the rest of the document at all. So CSS just pretends it's not there. So we're not going to bother with positioning elements around it. The elements are just going to fill in the space where element number 1 would have been, which is why number 2 is way up here. But you'll also notice something interesting is we can use those same top, left, right, and bottom values. So let's change our top here to be 0, for example. And if we save, you'll notice something interesting. We've taken the top of our element and we've put it 0 pixels away from the top of our screen. And this is something about position absolute, which is different than position relative, is that absolute is based on the position of something else. Relative is always based on the position of yourself. So you're moving yourself 10 pixels from where you would have normally been. When we had element 1 here that was relative, we moved it down 10 pixels from itself. But with absolute, we're basing this right now off of the size of our entire page, essentially our whole page. Even if we scrolled, if I select here our body, and I just put a min height of 200 VH, that'll just let us scroll. You'll see element 1 stays stuck to the very, very top of our page. It is 100% at the top, and it doesn't actually scroll with our page, which is really important. Let's just comment that out for now. Another really important thing to know about absolute is we can base this position off of whatever we want. By default, it's going to be based on your body, essentially your whole page. But if we instead wanted our child 1 to be positioned based on the parent, all we need to do is give the parent some form of position element. So we could come in here and we could say we want this to be a position of relative. As we know, that's not actually going to change the layout of our parent unless we use top, left, right, or bottom, but it is going to give our parent what's called a position context. And that means that all the absolutely positioned elements inside of it are going to be based on this parent, which now has its own position context. And if we save, you'll notice that now the top of element 1 is 0 pixels from the top of our parent instead of from the top of our body. And that's again because we created what's called a position context by using this position relative. And by modifying the position of an element to be anything but static, so we could use absolute here, we could use relative, as well as the other positions we're going to talk about in a little bit. If we change it to any value but static, we create a new position context, and now all the absolutely positioned elements inside of that context are going to be based off of the parent, in our case this position relative, instead of based on the entire body of our page. So whatever the closest non-statically positioned element is going to be what our absolute positioned element is based off of. Another important thing to note about absolute is since it's taken out of the document flow, you see our element 1 is no longer the full width of our parent, because our parent really doesn't know that child exists, and the child doesn't really know it exists inside the parent. If you instead wanted your child to be filling up an entire width, what we could do in here is just come down. We could set our left to be 0, and we could set our right to be 0. And if we save, you notice the left side of our element is going to be 0 pixels from the left side of our parent, and the right side is 0 pixels from the right side of the parent. So we essentially are able to span the entire width. These top, left, and right properties just tell us how far we want the left edge of our element to be from the left edge of whatever it's inside of, so in this case our parent, because it's position relative. If we remove the relative from our parent and save, you'll notice now our element spans from the left to the right of our entire page instead of just the left and right of our parent. So that's that position context coming into play here. Now the next type of position that I want to talk about is very similar to absolutely positioned. This is called position fixed. So we're just going to come in here, type in position of fixed, and if we save, you're going to notice immediately that this position fixed element is based off of our screen size. Even though it's inside of a parent with a position relative, so it's inside of a position context, it still gets pushed out to the page level because position fixed is always based off of the screen. That is whatever is visible to the user. That means if we scroll our page, something interesting is going to happen, and that this element actually follows us all the way down the page, as you can see here. It is always stuck to the very top of our page, no matter what happens. And that's because we have our top set to 0. If we change this to be a bottom of 0, you can now see it is stuck to the bottom of our page, no matter where we scroll to. So again, this is something super important to understand. Position fixed is just like position absolute, but it is always based on the screen size, and it is always going to be on the screen. That means no matter where you scroll, no matter what you do, it is always going to be stuck to the screen at whatever position we set. So we could say 10 pixels from the bottom, and our element is always going to sit there 10 pixels from the bottom of our screen. Now, the very last type of position I want to talk about is one that is actually pretty easy to understand because it is a combination of different elements we already have talked about, and that is position of sticky. So let's just change this to sticky here, and if we save, you'll notice something interesting. It works pretty much just like our normal relative position. As you can see, our element is normally where it would be, our other elements are in the position they would be around that element, but something really interesting that happens is when we scroll our page down, you'll notice as soon as element 1 touches the top of our page, it now becomes stuck to the top of our page because we have a top of 0 being set, and it is now fixed to the top of our page. But once element 1 reaches the bottom of its parent, you'll notice it becomes unstuck. We are now no longer stuck to the top of our page, and it allows us just to scroll onwards as if nothing ever happened. And when we get back to the top here, element 1 pretends its position relative when it no longer is stuck to the top of the page. And if we change our top here to be something else, for example, we change it to be 10 pixels, and we save, you'll now notice 1 gets stuck to the top of our page when it's 10 pixels away from the top. So essentially, what this sticky position allows us to do is let an element be relatively positioned in its normal place on the page as if it was just a static positioned element, nothing at all is changing. And then as soon as we scroll our page in a way that these different conditions, whether top, left, right, or bottom, become active, we now have a fixed position element, which is going to follow us as we scroll. And then as soon as it reaches the boundaries of its parent element, it's going to no longer scroll with us, and it's just going to get stuck and go back up off the top of our page. So it becomes fixed position while scrolling inside the parent. And then when outside the parent, it's obviously not going to be stuck anymore because it's confined to its actual parent. And when we are at the very top, when there's none of these conditions being met, it just is positioned exactly as it normally would be. And a really important thing to note about this sticky position here is that it doesn't depend on any position context. If we remove this position relative from our parent and we go and scroll our page, you're going to notice it still stops when it reaches the bottom of its parent. And that's because sticky position is based off of the HTML. So we have here our parent element, which has child 1 inside of it. So when child 1 reaches the bottom of its parent, it is no longer going to scroll with our page because it's reaching outside the bounds of its parent, which it cannot do when it's using sticky position. And this sticky position is great when you have a list of long things with titles. So you want to have, for example, a title at the very top of your page and then a bunch of things underneath of it, and you want that title to scroll with you as you go through the list. Sticky position is absolutely perfect for that because it'll follow you through your list, and when you get to the bottom of your list, it'll just go away as if it was never there at all. Now earlier I talked about how this topic of learning position, as well as learning a bunch of other topics, is going to really open your eyes to how you can build things that you think of and that you see, and I want to demonstrate that now with just a couple examples of images. So here we just have a modal design. You can see we have a title, we have some text, just a normal pop-up modal, but something really important to note is the X button in the top right-hand corner. We know we always want our X button to be in the top right corner, and there's a bunch of ways that we could get this X button to be there, but one really, really easy way to do that is just to create an X button and then position absolute it inside of your modal. So your modal has a position of relative to give you that context that you're inside of, and then you just position this X absolutely in the top right hand corner, maybe 5 pixels away from the top right corner on the top and the right side. And there you go, you now have an X button, which no matter what you do to your screen is always in the top right corner. And this simple knowledge of understanding position has made the jump of seeing this design and then actually knowing how to implement it really easy, because you know, make your modal position relative and make the X position absolute. Another idea here, we have this nav bar that we know we always want to be at the top of our page. You've probably gone to a website where as you scroll, the nav bar follows you down the page, and that's just super simple. Use position fixed on the nav bar and it's just going to be fixed to the top of our screen no matter what, which is exactly what we want. Another scenario here, let's take for example that we have this table design that you see here, and let's say it's really, really long. We have hundreds of entries in our table, and we want this header section, this blue section, to just follow us down the page as we scroll through our table. Well, in this case, position sticky makes the most sense because we want it to stay normal as if it was just at the top of our page like this, but as we start scrolling down our list, as the page touches the top of this navigation, this table header, we want that to follow us down our page until we get to the bottom of the table, and then we no longer want it to follow us, so position sticky is perfect for this use case. And I'm sure if you went through the designs that you've thought of or designs that you plan to build, there's probably hundreds of scenarios where just this small tip of learning position has really opened your eyes to what you can build and how you can build things. And it's just probably saved you hours of work with building out different designs now that you understand in depth how these different properties of CSS work together.